In this next material video here, we're going to be discussing there's a lot of miscellaneous materials and textures, and I'm just going to kind of scratch the surface on those and discuss some of the ones that I end up using a lot. I'm going to kind of go through them fast. I've got this scene saved out into materials miscellaneous so that it can be a collection of all of this stuff and all the different shaders that we end up making. You'll have some examples for. Cool. So just to kind of start out here, we're going to start out with the material wrapper and material render stats shaders. These are purely utility shaders. I've got this fern that we were working in, the two-sided material fern, looking at the translucency before. Now we're going to be looking at, let's first start out with actually we're going to put both of them in here. So first we've got our V-Ray material render stats. And next we've got our V-Ray material wrapper. If you look at the attributes on these, it's pretty straightforward. It's just simply the overrides for the render stats from the V-Ray single object properties, and also the overrides for the rest of the surface properties, and also the matte surface properties. So you can actually just connect our shader here. So we've got our V-Ray material two-sided going into the wrapper. And then next I'm just going to hold down Control, middle click drag, connect that into the V-Ray render stats, and then connect that into the shader. If you look at my outliner, I do already have the fern in a single object properties, and it's not really doing anything right now. You can see that primary visibility is on, matte surface is turned set to off, everything's just standard renderable object. But these two shaders can be used in situations where you need to quickly override something. So, if I was in, say, a render layer, let me take my fern, we'll just drop it in here. Maybe by default our shader is going like that. And in this other render layer, some emergency came up. I need to override the leaves only in this fern. And rather than redoing all my single object properties, I can insert these two shaders to get full control over that. And I can create a layer override, connect that in, and then on this layer, the primary visibility, for example, will override the primary visibility that's on the single object properties. It will also override the render stats that are on the actual object. So if you want to use a shader-based approach, it's a little bit easier to visualize maybe, not sure. These two shaders are there for you. So you can see if we kind of bounce back over, that shader connection swaps again. I'm actually just going to connect it here so that we can see it, and we'll get my IPR going. And cool, you can see, kind of interesting, so in this beauty render now, because I turned off the primary visibility of the leaf on the fern, those objects are primary visibility off. They're still casting shadows and GI and all of that. They're just not in the render. And we do have the fiddlehead and stem still visible. At the same time, if I turn that primary visibility checkbox back on, sorry, those leaves were black, just had to redo my IPR. You can see if I now go in and just dial my wrapper, turn on that matte surface, and this will become transparent and we will see the sky through the leaves. So if for whatever reason you need these overrides, they're available to you on a shader level rather than simply by adding objects to other single object properties or any of that craziness. We can just insert these into a shader tree to effectively use them. On a related note, something that we can do to ever override a ray switch on the material level. This is something I didn't really get to go over in the material section, but we do have available to us now under the attributes V-Ray material override. I can insert this ray switch on any shader, actually. So you can see on my V-Ray material two-sided, I have the V-Ray material override. I like to do it on my shading engine quite a bit because I may have different materials that I want to use for GI or for reflection, for example. Or what also comes up very frequently is needing a similar ray switch in texture form for a shader. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Let me turn off that material override here. And so this ray switch, if you're not familiar with it, same thing with the material override. It's just a way to get a different texture being looked at in different parts of your render. So for example, in this case, I'm bouncing GI through these leaves with opacity. So what I may want to do instead of using the texture, I can just make my GI texture white. Let me stop my IPR here. And I can map that leaf alpha into the ray switch, into all of the other slots. So reflection and refraction. So those are all good. And now on my fern material front and back, I can map this ray switch into that opacity. And it might speed up my render a little bit. There we go. So it's something, you may not really notice it in small little scenes like this, but we may see it pretty intensely on a scene with a lot of opacity. We can get in there with the ray switch and do this kind of stuff. So let's do a quick IPR. Cool, and you can see that the render looks exactly the same using this ray switch, but the actual under the hood texture switching is happening and potentially saving us a little bit of render time. Cool. So another, I just want to go over, I'm not really going to show examples of them, but I want to just make a note of them that they exist. So if we go to create node, and by the way, I highly encourage you to look at the documentation and really see all of the nodes that are available to us, because if we look, there's a lot of shaders here. There's some volumetric stuff. We've got 2D textures. We only have one 3D texture right now for the particles, but there's our V-Ray Sky. There's V-Ray PTEX if you've got PTEX stuff coming from Mari. In utilities, we've got all sorts of stuff. V-Ray Curvature we can use to detect edges on an object. Distance texture. You can add objects to different sets to get distance between them, which is usable in a blend shader, for example. So you could blend from like a water material that's darker blue to a more turquoise as islands are rising up out of it, as an example. Lots of different stuff. So just, you can look at each of them and you can, look up in the documentation what they are. So just as an example here, if you just go to the docs, you've got chaosgroup.com, V-Ray 3 materials, you can see all of the rundown of everything. In the nodes and attributes section here, you can see, let's go back to the root. We've got materials, lights, textures, volumetrics, all kinds of cool stuff. But the next one we're going to look at real quick is going to be this V-Ray switch material here. So the way this V-Ray switch material works is you can simply have this slider right here, and you can just, it's kind of like a dumbed down version of a V-Ray blend material. So I'm going to connect up a whole bunch of V-Ray materials real quick to this, and then we'll look at how it works on the actual object end. Cool, so just kind of did that legwork there to get this all connected, and you can kind of see we just got 10 different V-Ray materials all connected in here, and I assigned it to the fern, so I've got an IPR running, and as you can see, there's no opacity blending or anything. It's just, rounding down, so you can see if I go up to 1.9, it's going to stay that yellow material, and then right when I go to 2, it switches to the green material. So you can see it'll just go down. These aren't actually in order anymore, but the green material is number 2. And you can just kind of go through that whole list, and it'll just switch through each of your shaders for you, which is kind of cool. So it's, it, I guess, can be sort of useful. I've never had. I usually just end up using a blend material because there's usually, I if I want something to be blending or just swapping from one shader to another, I don't usually want a hard line. There's usually something going on where I'm actually blending rather than switching, thus the names here. But it is worth just kind of mentioning that this shader is there. Somebody else may find some use for it. But you could even paint a black and white map, just as an example here. Let's stop this. And on my node editor here, I could paint a black and white or just use a noise texture or something here. And we can just insert a remap. Sorry, let's get that back in screen here. Insert a color remap, and we can just remap this noise from 0 to 10. Oops. Just like that. And this can actually be a texture. So we can take my out color red and make it my material switch. And you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So let's get a sphere as well, just so we can, I don't know what the UV situation's like on this fern, so we can just have both. There we go. Now I can click IPR real quick. And there's our Crazy Town shader switching magic. So, that does give you a little bit of control here. So if you wanted, you can see what's going on exactly. I can pull that down, clamp that, so I get, different whatever it may be. So there is some creative kind of stuff you can do, but just bear in mind that you can do similar things with the V-Ray blend material. Most situations, the V-Ray blend material is going to work nicely, but if you want this one global controller to be the switch, as the material name is, then you can use this instead. So cool. And let's go ahead on to the next. So just looking at our list here, there's a couple I just want to touch on that are pretty cool, that are just simply really kind of worth mentioning. Not really going to get into these either, but first there's this V-Ray material OSL, which stands for Open Shading Language. And the Open Shading Language is very interesting from a pipeline standpoint. If you're ever in a large facility, needing the ability to open shaders across packages, for example, going from Maya to Houdini, or maybe even from Maya to Unity or that kind of thing, you may be able to, if you have any rendering package that uses Open Shading Language, and gaming and stuff may not get there in the future. I don't have any idea, but this Open Shading Language, you will get extremely similar results from package to package, because all of the reflections and everything are all done in the code on the shader, rather than there being, for example, the V-Ray material compared to the Arnold material compared to the RenderMan material. It's all in there. Another new thing that V-Ray has added in this version is this V-Ray material GLSL for OpenGL shading language. So if that's your thing and you're into that, they have tons of examples of that on the documentation. Not really my thing, but it's in there. It's a new feature. We've also got this V-Ray point particle. And the V-Ray point particle shader, if we just go and open up a node editor here, and we'll make one of these. It's a very simple shader, and it's really only for particles that are coming from a V-Ray proxy or that are stored inside of an Alembic. And if your V-Ray proxy render mode is set to point, so if we create a VR mesh here, you can see that, particle render mode you can set to point, and then you can use this shader here if you want to. If you've got particles that are stored in there, those particles can be coming from RealFlow that are stored and converted into V-Ray mesh form. Houdini can write particles into Alembics, so there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with that. And bringing in those particles from other rendering packages and then rendering them in V-Ray can be a really nice way to do things like cast shadows, cast GI off of the particles that are being rendered elsewhere as well. If we go back over to our list of materials here, another one that I do just want to very briefly mention, and again, I'm not really going to get into all of the finer points of it, but that's a pretty cool new feature in V-Ray 3 is this V-Ray VR matte shader. And the way this works is this V-Ray's created a VR matte editor, and you can see right here you can open and edit materials and export materials from Maya, or, this is the cool part, from 3D Studio Max. You can load them up in this material editor and then apply them to shaders in your scene across a different package. Right now, it does only go from 3D Studio Max to Maya or back again, so from Maya to 3D Studio. But if you're, I don't know if, depending on how long you've been researching V-Ray, V-Ray was around for a long time on the 3D Studio Max side before it became so big in visual effects for Maya and all of that, especially in the 3D Studio side. It was really big in architectural rendering, and there are entire websites devoted to V-Ray materials that are for 3D Studio Max. And this is a really nice first start to getting that stuff exported from 3D Studio and usable on the Maya side as well. So I'm sure this is going to keep evolving and growing, but it's a really awesome new thing. The last shader that I wanted to touch on, we've already discussed the V-Ray car paint material. Something that is pretty cool, though, that you can do is actually use the flake from the V-Ray car paint, and you can actually use that as a shader by itself. So you can add flake to anything. To be honest, the main place I use this all the time is with snow. And snow has a really glittery appearance to it. And so you can see here's our flake on our sphere here. Let's kind of stop our IPR and we will move our camera over here a little bit. So just as an example to use this V-Ray flake in a pretty cool way, we can create a V-Ray material, and we can make this V-Ray material pretty white. This can be our snow. This should totally be some sort of subsurface material or something like that, but this is fine for right now. And we can pump this in through a V-Ray blend material. And we can have our base material be the white snow shader, whether that's a subsurface or a regular, whatever you want to do. And then your flake can be your coat material. And you can set that to additive mode if you want to. So it just gets added right on top, or you can just simply have the flake, rather than it being blue, you can make it a nice kind of white, and that will have a different glossiness value than your actual shader, and you'll get some nice little glittery effects. So for example, I can lower my scale down. There we go. And I can do a quick test render here. And I only have the flake right now, so we do need to go in and control middle click drag, connect that default connection there. There we go. That looks a little bit better. And you can see we've got our just white shader with that really subtle, just kind of glittery effect going on. So, it's able to take that really beautiful procedural flake out of the car paint material, and you can place it onto anything, which is great. So we're going to go over a couple of the V-Ray specific textures next, and then we're going to wrap up this video just kind of go through in the same process here. There's a couple I want to talk about in this list, and then we're going to bounce over to a studio lighting setup where we can talk about the new V-Ray softbox texture, which is pretty awesome. So just really quickly, very briefly, we talked about this a little bit in the Render Elements demo, but we do have the V-Ray Dirt shader, which is your ambient occlusion shader. Let's get our render going. Okay, cool. And this V-Ray Dirt shader, because it's an ambient occlusion, you can also utilize this as a mask for additional shading. So in this example here, I've got my snowy, glittery white sphere. Maybe we should hide our tie-dyed plant. We'll get rid of that. So when you guys open the scene, that'll be hidden. All the shaders will be there. And anyways, cool. So we can bleed some color up onto this sphere or bleed up a different shader completely via that V-Ray Dirt material. So let's graph this. And so using our same blend that we've got, I can create a V-Ray Dirt. And if you guys open the file from the for this ground too, you'll see I actually utilize the to where I'm mapping a darker brown dirt texture around where objects were intersecting it in the scene file with all the cacti in the desert. So let's go ahead and we can just map this V-Ray blend with that dirt, and we need one more V-Ray material. And what I like to do when I'm doing this kind of stuff is I'll map it just some crazy color just so I can see it and see exactly what I'm getting here. So see, it's inverted. I can tell that right away. So now I can go in on my V-Ray Dirt and I can say occluded color white, unoccluded color black. And so now I'm just kind of pushing some of that up across the sphere, which is awesome. And, maybe I could also multiply something into that to hold it out a little bit more. So just again, as an example here, I can use a multiply divide. I can map that V-Ray Dirt into input 1. I could map a file texture that I've got, maybe that grunge texture that we've been using, something like that. I can map that into input 2, and my connection editor popped up here, so I'm just going to say out color input 2, and then that multiply divide could actually be my blend amount. So we'll save, and we'll take this guy, we'll say output, and multiply divide into blend amount. And we'll hopefully get, yep, exactly. So you can see we're getting a little bit more texture running through that now. So it's not just a soft, you can see down in here, we're starting to hold that out a little bit differently. Which is awesome. Very cool. Very cool stuff. So that's just one of the more creative ways we can use the V-Ray Dirt material. You can also see there are bias, so you can have something be more on the y-axis. So just as an example again here, let me create some more geo here. I'm going to clean up my panels, pause the video here for a sec. Cool, so I just, let's turn off that history here. So I've got a poly coming out, just a cylinder coming out of my sphere here. You can see that that ambient occlusion shader is going in and just casting, an evenly distributed ring of dirt around it. And so if I go in and dial that bias and Y up, you can see it's going to shove all of it down underneath that cylinder. And because I'm, essentially now I'm only creating dirt coming down in Y from this plane, I lose it across the bottom here as well. So, if I had both of these objects and I wanted to use the dirt for both, I may need to paint one or something. Or I could even, have this just be a different shader. The next texture I want to go over here is, I hid that cylinder. I'm just going to assign a new V-Ray material to this object. It's just quite simply going to be the V-Ray Fresnel. The V-Ray Fresnel we've gone over a little bit. It's really, I use it quite a bit. You can use it as a mask for your objects. In this case, I've got it pumping in through the diffuse. And it's just going to go in and essentially save you the step of doing the sampler info connection in Maya. You can see we've got an index of refraction that'll dial that up and down. It's really only going to give you the fall off. There's no other attributes or anything on it. It's only going to be that fall off from the center to the edge via the index of refraction. If you need something a little bit more customizable, like maybe I want a ring around the center right here, you are still going to need to use sampler info into a ramp. Another very helpful texture, I'm just again going to map it right into my diffuse color here on this shader, is actually, if we go over here, create node, under 2D texture, we're going to do this V-Ray edges next. If any of you guys are doing a portfolio, and you're, especially for modeling, and you want to be able to show the wireframe of your model, this is going to be your shader. I like to keep this in width type pixels, but if you're doing the wireframe of an entire environment and you have objects trickling way off into the distance, like I actually do, let's assign it to the ground here as well. So on my ground shader that I've got going on, this is the ground shader. What I'm going to do is actually map this into another V-Ray blend. And I just want to have the V-Ray edges be set to additive mode on this shader. So there we go. And so you can see I'm actually going to have different edges on this guy here. Cool. So you can see if I keep this, but again, this is actually a really nice effect. You can also, just like any 2D texture, you can map that into a render element using the extra texture render element. So if you want to have your wireframe just kick out to a render element, you can do that. What I want to show you is that, back in the background here, if you keep the lines a consistent width, they can get a little bit cramped up, especially as things kind of trickle off into the distance. So you do have the option to go in and keep this in world space. Instead, you can find a width that works well. So let's try 2. Probably too big. We'll try 1. But you get the idea. We can see those edges being 1 pixel, and then as they kind of trickle back into the background, they come into focus. You can see them a little bit better. So it's very versatile. You can already see in this example, I'm creating 2 different, I've got 2 different V-Ray edge shaders going on. If you wanted to go in on render elements and have 2 separate render elements for different edge options, you can do that as well. You can also create a brand new render layer and do something like this, where you have a kind of, lit V-Ray edges. Like this is kind of cool on this object here, where we've got the GI on the one side and the actual lighting on the other. So you've got a lot of, versatility with that. So we're going to bounce over to our other scene here and take a look at this V-Ray softbox texture and also the hair shader. So here we are. We've got a simple, just kind of studio scene, 3 simple spheres, and 1 beautiful, if I do say so myself, V-Ray rectangular light. So one of the big things that we're always doing with these rectangular lights is mapping textures to them. And there's a good reason for that, because when we look directly into them, they are just gigantic white cards floating out in space. And a lot of times we want to have some sort of texture on them so that they're not just a gigantic white card, especially in reflections. We want to be able to see the texture of the cloth that's wrapped around the light box all that sort of stuff, or the softbox. So V-Ray in version 3 has included a V-Ray softbox texture, which is very interesting. So I'm just going to briefly show that. And so I'm going to turn on this use rectangular texture checkbox, and then I'm going to map in the V-Ray softbox texture. So right off the bat here, what I do want to do is we can see, I want to get the actual intensity on the color down. I'm going to set it to 1 so we can actually see what we're doing inside of this texture. So first I want to turn on a hotspot, and you can see immediately I'm able to get, you could even set your base color to black, and now you're going to be getting an actual circular fall off in this. And where this is pretty cool is you can actually start, if you're really into it, you can start doing all sorts of stuff. So you can turn on a frame gradient. So we can set that to, black to white. And we can start moving this around as we want to. Maybe we want to flip that guy actually. So we can do something a little bit. So there we go. That's feeling pretty cool. We can undo that. Let's bring our box back here. We can also do radial vignettes. Again, you can set this to just simply white. So you can see we get this really beautiful fall off going through there. And the fall offs just have a really, you can see it's, even on the edges, there's these nice rings going through a lot of them. So you can also say turn on, a horizontal vignette as well. And set that to white. And so you can see now that's actually going to multiply through that. So it's pretty cool. Start doing some cool stuff. And then, again, I can multiply in a vertical vignette across the same thing. You also have some tiling options here. You can start fading things a little bit differently as you want to. Oops, probably went a little too far there. But yeah, it's definitely got some really interesting options in this. And, it it is really... so we can turn up that hotspot a little bit. There we go. That's feeling pretty nice. It's nice to have this all in a texture format, but don't feel like you have to use it. There's nothing stopping you from doing this in Photoshop even, getting it mapped in there. The one thing that I do want to mention if you decide to use this at all is you do want to go in and let me turn up the brightness a little here. So you can actually see now, because I'm now bouncing light off of the foreground onto the wall behind me, you can see that there's actually black in this card. If you want that to be invisible, transparent, you can just go in and simply set the rectangular text alpha to 0. And then it will just be a transparent blob of light in your scene, which is kind of cool. If you did have other kind of stuff in there, like maybe a piece of metal or something in the texture that you did want to show up, you could actually create an alpha or map the same out color from the texture into that alpha. But yeah, that's essentially it. It's definitely a nice addition. You can see these really beautiful gradients you get in your speculars are not just going to happen on their own, and you do need to get some sort of texture in there to do that. You can also, if you had a texture of a softbox that you wanted to, have this kind of control on, you can always map this into the color gain of your file texture. So while we've got the scene open, I'm going to pause and just create some V-Ray fur, and we will take a look at the hair shader. Cool, so got my IPR rolling again. You can see I've got some V-Ray fur in my scene. I am going to go over to my V-Ray RT and turn on fur. So we can get some V-Ray fur rolling in our V-Ray RT here. And since that doesn't seem to be working, I'm going to stop my IPR and restart it. if that ever happens to you, please, by all means, just stop it and restart it. Cool. So our fuzzy sphere here in the middle has inherited the same material as what's underneath of it, which is kind of weird. So I'm just going to take my 3 spheres and assign a V-Ray material to them. And then my V-Ray fur here, I am actually going to select and assign a new material that we haven't talked about yet, which is going to be the V-Ray hair material 3. And there we go. Things are looking a little thick right now as well, so I am going to take this V-Ray fur and go to the V-Ray fur properties here and set the thickness down to 0.1. So there we go. And we can increase the, maybe we can just give it a little bit more, maybe double the amount of hair. It's to say 20. That's a little, yeah, there we go. It's a little thicker. Maybe we can get a little bit messier of a look. A little bit, there we go, cool. And then maybe even 30. Whoa, not 330. There we go. So we got a pretty dense amount of fur here. And what I really want to show is just a couple key settings on this hair shader. First, the nicest thing, they have some really nice presets. So they work great. Do blonde matted hair, or matted as in like matte, like not shiny. Then there's the respective shiny as well, which is pretty cool. This is all going to be driven. This is kind of a dark scene right now, but you can see if I create another light here. Now let's create like a V-Ray sphere light. We'll put this sphere light up in the corner here, and we'll set that to invisible. Give it a little temperature, a bit of warmth, and we'll set that radius up to 10. And now we'll set that intensity to 150. Now we're getting somewhere. You can see how the preset is feeling pretty nice. With hair, the way we're going to be dealing with this, you can see we've got the secondary specular is locking its color to this transmission. And this transmission is really where all of the color is going to come. So you can see if I brighten this, we'll get a much lighter blonde, and then I can even desaturate it. So now it's like getting more towards that bleached blonde color, which is pretty cool. And then, you can see that the primary specular is actually fairly weak right now, but it has 0 saturation in it. So you can see if I really started cranking that up, we're going to start getting some really intense specular off of these, so you can use it sparingly. They have it turned down fairly low for a reason, because you will get some pretty hot highlights pretty quickly. The other main thing I really want to talk about with this is in this options right here. You do have the option for opaque shadows and opaque GI. There's good reason for that. This is kind of a built-in little ray switcher, and that's because if you're using transparency, so for example, if I want the tips of my hair to be a little thinner, having the shadows be transparent on hair can add tons and tons of render time, and same with the GI. So having the ability to go in and have, even though technically the shadow would be wrong, you will save yourself quite a bit of headache. So cool. So that's kind of a very brief rundown on the hair shader. Definitely just play around with it. I always start with these presets. They're really great, even just as a, seeing how a shader's built. They obviously need some adjustment. I just did black shiny and got a pretty solid black shader. The way my lighting is, I need to just increase the specular quite a bit. So, you can play with the glossiness. Maybe that primary gloss needs to get spread a little bit, so you can dial some of these settings around. And just really have some fun with it. So it's a really, really nice little hair shader. Drop it in anything furry that you got going on and see what you get. So that's kind of the end of our, as much as we can cram in on the materials. So there's really a ton of them on the textures and materials. So I really do just kind of encourage you. You can see here if you look at there's just really tons of stuff here. If you go to nodes and attributes in the documentation, there's materials, and there's even stuff that I didn't even have a chance to touch on. So definitely check the docs. And as you get more and more used to V-Ray, everything we covered in this video set will get you well on your way to most any kind of object. A lot of the stuff we didn't go over is the utility-based textures and that kind of thing. So cool. On to the next chapter.